Welcome to Lesson 32 of the Life of Christ, Christ's Betrayal, Arrest, and Trial. This lesson covers Wednesday night and Thursday morning of Missal 14, the last week of Christ's earthly ministry. After Jesus finished his high priestly prayer, his disciples followed their master down the hillside from the temple to the bottom of the ravine, Brook Kidron. This was a small brook in a ravine that separated the temple and the eastern side of the city of Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. This picture shows the Kidron Valley looking south. The dried up Kidron is just to the right of the road. The hill to the left is the Mount of Olives, and that to the right is the base of Mount Moriah. The temple is at the top of the hill to the right. In the spring, the brook often swelled from the runoff of melting snow on the northern mountains. The word Kidron means cedars and refers to the famous cedar forest to the north in Lebanon mountains. On the other side of the brook Kidron was the olive orchard called the Garden in the KJV, known as Gethsemane. It was a favorite resting place of the Lord, undoubtedly. He had spent many nights in that spot. If we look at John 18, 1 through 2, it tells us this. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the brook Cedron, where the garden into which he entered, and his disciples. And Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus oftentimes resorted thither with his disciples. It was a little after midnight, and the night air was likely chilly. The splashing brook nearby and the fresh scent of spring flowers veiled the awful events that would soon follow. The disciples were getting sleepy and assumed that the Lord would spend the night there in the quietness of the garden, a nice, peaceful place. The Lord stopped, told his disciples to rest there, and took Peter, James, and John further into the garden with him. He told his inner circle to remain with him and pray while he went still a little further into the garden alone. The Lord was well aware of what was happening, but the poor disciples, tired and confused, gradually succumbed to sleep, huddling together under the olive trees to keep warm. Two gardens are prominent in the Scripture, the Garden of Eden and the Garden of Gethsemane. In the Garden of Eden, Satan began the battle of the ages by entering that garden to tempt Eve and thereby attack the Lord. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Christ retaliated by entering the garden not to hide, but to conquer. He knew that Judas was on his way with a band of men, and in this garden he would begin his final conquest of Satan. The drama of this night may be portrayed in the four following acts. Act 1 was the betrayal and the arrest of Christ. Act 2, the trial before Caiaphas, Annas, and the Sanhedrin. Act 3 was Peter's denial. And the final act, Act 4, was the trial before Pilate. This particular lesson covers the first three of those four acts. The next lesson will cover the last one. Although John's Gospel does not cover Christ's agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, if you have time and desire to do so, it may be profitable to examine the other Gospels. So let's begin with Act 1. I'm going to read John 18, verses 2 through 13. And Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus ofttimes resorted thither with his disciples. Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, cometh thither with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus saith unto them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. As soon then as he had said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. Then asked he them again, Whom seek ye? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. If therefore ye seek me, let these go their way, that the same might be fulfilled which he spake Of them which thou gavest me have I lost none. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, and smote the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. And the servant's name was Malchus. Then said Jesus unto Peter, Put up thy sword into thy sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? Then the band and the captain of the officers of the Jews took Jesus, and bound him, and led them away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. So Christ's agony in Gethsemane had barely ended when Judas arrived with a great multitude. They had come down from the eastern gate of Jerusalem and were approaching the entrance to the garden. Sometimes we're tempted to imagine that this group numbered perhaps only 10 to 15 people in addition to Judas. But that is incorrect. The Greek word that John used to refer to a Roman cohort, which could range in size from 200 to 1,000 soldiers. They certainly didn't want Jesus to get away from them this time. In front of these several hundred soldiers were the Levitical policemen from the temple. Behind the soldiers were members of the Sanhedrin. The entire company was armed with swords and staves, and they carried lanterns and torches in case they had to hunt for Jesus in the recesses of the garden. They were a formidable body intent on arresting Jesus. Judas was leading them, but they were a short distance behind him. It was as though he was rushing ahead toward Christ, possibly to warn Jesus of the danger and to console him. He flung himself at Jesus, sobbed, Master, Master. Then he kissed him. He not only kissed him, but did so repeatedly. Later that night, Christ's face would be marred and scarred in many ways, furrowed by bloody sweat, bruised with blows, spat upon, and rent with thorns. But nothing so pierced his heart as the kisses of blasphemy. Judas, betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss? Jesus asked him in an anguished cry. In verses 4 through 6, we see Jesus actually capturing the enemy. This scene raises the question of who captured whom. The soldiers came to conquer and to arrest, but they are the ones who are vanquished. The Lord, knowing that the multitude had arrived to arrest him, did not try to hide. Instead, he stepped out of the shadows and issued a booming question. Whom seek ye? The band of men, caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the Lord, whom they had expected to have to hunt down like an animal, called out, Jesus of Nazareth, not in the least suspecting that the stranger who addressed them was their indeed prey. Without blinking an eye, the Lord answered, I am he. At that point, the men were so startled that they reeled back and, stepping one upon another, fell to the ground. There was something extraordinarily subduing in the voice and presence of Christ. Remember in the time when he cleared the temple, the hardened Jewish leaders, though numerous and powerful, fled in terror before him. The fact of the matter is that instead of catching Christ, he caught them. How ridiculous they looked and felt as they lay in a heap on the ground, fumbling with their clothes and their weapons. Jesus bent over that poor heap of sinful humanity and once more asked the question, Whom seek ye? The men stood erect, tried to gain composure and dignity. Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. Again Christ answered, I am he. If therefore ye seek me, let these go their way, referring to his disciples. His questioning them a second time compelled them to see that they were not the conquerors or captors in this case. Rather, he was surrendering himself voluntarily. He was clearly the master of the situation. Remember, Christ had already said that he was going to lay down his life. No man would take it. And when the time came, he himself would take it up again. The second thing I'd like to point out is that Jesus protected his disciples. Even in this moment of apparent danger, Jesus' first concern was for the poor, cowardly disciples. Let these go their way, he demanded. He had not only prayed for the keeping of their and our souls in John 17, but also now showed his determination to keep theirs and our souls alive. This shows that the Lord is just as concerned about our physical welfare as our spiritual welfare. Set in contrast to Christ's defense of his disciples is their attempt to defend him. If you look at verses 10 and 11, what happened? You come to think of it, what was Peter, a fisherman, doing with a sword? Did he suspect trouble? Did he think that he could really defend God? Whatever Peter's reasoning is in carrying the sword, and the scripture doesn't really give us an answer specific to that question, he apparently thought that the Lord needed some sort of help and that he could provide it. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Of course, Peter's attempt to defend Christ was pitiful at best, which is what one might expect from a fisherman who was untrained in the use of weapons. He managed only to cut off a man's ear, but Jesus immediately healed the man, restoring his ear, and then he rebuked Peter for his reliance on a fleshly method. I want you to note that Christ didn't rebuke Peter for his poor aim, but for thinking that the weapons of this world would be effective in a spiritual battle. This scene shows the difference between someone who has been bathed in prayer, like Jesus Christ, and someone who had been asleep, Peter. Because they had not remained awake and in prayer with their masters, the disciples are blinded and bewildered by the sudden appearance of an arresting band. Jesus probably saved Peter's life by healing Malchus and rebuking Peter so quickly. The professional soldiers would undoubtedly have pounced upon him and made short work of him had Christ not intervened. How often the Lord saves us from our stumbling, bumbling attempts, and how often we would avoid making such mistakes if only we would watch and pray instead of sleeping spiritually. So that brings us to Act 2, the trial before Annas, Caiaphas, and the Sanhedrin. We're going to read verses 12 to 14, and then I'm going to skip to verse 19 and read to verse 24. Then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him, and led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Now verse 19. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always report, and in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me, what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I have said. And when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? And Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas the high priest. So let's take a look at Annas. The process of Christ's trial occurred at 3 different times between midnight, or shortly thereafter, and 3 o'clock in the morning. First, they led him bound to the house of Annas. We see that in verse 13. The picture that you see on your screen now shows the top of the steep steps leading up from Tyropoeon Valley toward the upper city of Jerusalem in the proximity of Annas and Caiaphas' mansions. It was probably these very steps the Lord ascended on the night of his betrayal and arrest. At last they arrive at Annas' mansion. This picture is one of many rooms of the high priest's mansion. The remains of the mansion revealed what many archaeologists think was the high priest's house. It was at least 5,000 square feet and 2 to 3 stories high. The room you are looking at was once beautiful, with many decorated plastered walls, the floors appointed with delicate mosaics. The furniture depicted shows lavishly carved tables and jars of stone. Annas was an old man of 70 who had been the high priest 20 years earlier. The current high priest was Caiaphas, Annas' son-in-law. Because of his great influence, Annas was the virtual head of all religious affairs in Jerusalem. He was said to be very rich, and that his wealth came from the practice of selling merchandise in the temple. If that was indeed the case, then he probably hated Jesus because Jesus twice had disrupted his business. Although Annas had at this time no official position, he apparently had taken a leading role in this plotting of the arrest of Christ. That is probably why they took Christ to his house first. If we look at Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, the stop at Annas' house allowed time for the conspirators to gather the other members of the Sanhedrin. Messengers scoured the city, rousing the Jewish leaders from their beds and rushing them to the trial, which had to be finished by daybreak. They had no idea what the multitudes might do when they learned that their popular teacher had been arrested and was in the hands of the unpopular Jewish leaders. They hoped to have him sentenced and in the Roman hands by that time. But there was a catch. It wasn't legal to try a man at night. Therefore, it would be necessary to hold another court at daybreak. This trial, however, would be mere brief formality, a rehash of what was about to happen at Caiaphas' house. Crossing the courtyard of Caiaphas' house, the band led their captive to the semicircular room of the Sanhedrin. Around the arc of a semicircle, the 71 members of that body sat on benches. As president of the body, Caiaphas occupied the throne in the midst of the members, and Jesus was placed facing him. First, the high priest asked Christ about his disciples and his doctrine. We see that in John 18:19. Jesus protected his disciples, not mentioning them in his reply. Instead, he stings the high priest by stating, "Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me. What I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said." Once again, we see that he was clearly in control of the situation. A jailer, probably unaccustomed to hearing such simple, bold, and straightforward speech in that place, and knowing only the one poor criminals who were offering smooth flatteries, clenched his fist and struck Jesus on the mouth. What was Christ's response to this abuse? Did he lose his temper or his composure? How would you or I probably have responded? Christ responded differently. Christ didn't lose his temper or his composure. Instead, he maintained total control of the situation and challenged the jailer to give a reason for his vicious assault. Once again, Christ had caught them. They had no answer for the master of every situation. Although John does not record the fact, the members of the Sanhedrin were hard-pressed to find a charge on which to press the Lord. Finally, they committed subordination, bringing in two false witnesses whom they had bribed to lie under oath. The witnesses testified that they had heard Jesus say, "I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another without hands." It is difficult to determine what they could have made of this statement because he had said that he would rebuild the temple. The high priest, knowing that the accusation would get them nowhere, sprang forward and demanded of Jesus why he would answer nothing. "What is it which these witnesses against thee?" He pretended to believe that something of great enormity had been alleged, but he gave way to such unseemly excitement because he knew that nothing could be founded on it. Jesus merely looked on in silence. Silence often speaks better than the loudest words against a ridiculous accusation. The high priest knew that he was beaten, so he finally commanded Christ to confirm whether he was the Messiah. This was one of the great moments in the earthly life of Jesus. He answered clearly and solemnly, "Yes, I am." Jumping to his feet, the high priest lost all composure. He tore his clothing and cried, "What need have we of more witnesses? Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy." The men were so enraged that they lost all composure and dignity. They struck Christ with their sticks, spat in his face, drew something over his head, and struck him again, crying, "Christ, prophesy, who smote thee?" Imagine it. This was not done by ignorant passerbyers, but by dignified members of the Sanhedrin, the highest Jewish religious council. In their behavior, we see the depths of human nature. They waited until early morning and then led him to Pilate. It is possible that Jesus spent the rest of the night in a pit used for holding prisoners. In Jerusalem today, there is a pit below Caiaphas' house. The remains of the house are visible. At the top of the pit was a hole through which the prisoner was lowered with ropes under his arms. The bottom of the pit was a quagmire of filth. Mud and human waste cast a stench that was all but suffocating. A window on one side of the pit allowed a guard to peer in to make sure the prisoner was still alive. Here, Christ would have remained in total darkness, knowing that he had but a few hours to live before he would be hanged on a cross. Modern-day pilgrims can descend into the pit by steps, where they see Crusader crosses on the walls, an indication that Crusaders from the 10th and 11th centuries thought this pit was biblically significant. One can still see the hole through which the prisoner was lowered and the window through which the guard was able to watch. Let's take a moment to look at Psalm 88. As I read it, consider that it may refer to, in part, to Christ in this particular pit, perhaps even the words he uttered from the depths while he awaited execution. Especially pay close attention to verses 3 through 7. O Lord God of my salvation, I have cried day and night before thee. Let my prayer come before thee, and incline thine ear unto my cry. For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draweth nigh unto the grave. I am counted with them that go down into the pit. I am as a man that hath no strength, free among the dead like the slain that lie in the grave, whom thou rememberest no more, and they are cut off from thy hand. Thou hast laid me in the lowest pit, in darkness, in the deeps. Thy wrath lieth hard upon me, and thou hast afflicted me with all thy ways. Selah. Thou hast put away mine acquaintance far from me. Thou hast made me an abomination unto them. I am shut up, and I cannot come forth. My eye mourneth by reason of affliction. Lord, I have called daily upon thee. I have stretched out my hands unto thee. Wilt thou show wonders to the dead? Shall the dead arise and praise thee? Selah. Shall thy loving kindness be declared in the grave, or thy faithfulness in destruction? Shall thy wonders be known in the dark, and thy righteousness in the land of forgetfulness? But unto thee have I cried, O Lord, and in the morning shall my prayer prevent thee. Lord, why castest thou off my soul? Why hidest thou thy face from me? I am afflicted and ready to die from my youth up. While I suffer thy terrors, I am distracted. Thy fierce wrath goeth over me, thy terrors have cut me off. They have round about me daily like water, they compass me about together. Lover and friend hast thou put far from me, and my acquaintance into darkness. We do not know that he prayed this prayer on that lonely night, but we do know that he must have suffered inexcusable heartache as he waited for the coming day and the horrors of crucifixion after being forsaken by his disciples and friends. So that brings us to Act 3, which is Peter's denial. Now let's read John 18, verses 15 through 18, and then verses 25 through 27. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door without. Then went out that other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. Then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, Art not thou also one of this man's disciples? He saith, I am not. And the servants and the officers stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them, and warmed himself. Now down to verse 25. Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. They said therefore unto him, Art not thou one of his disciples? He denied it, and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter had cut off, saith, Did I not see thee in the garden with him? Peter then denied again, and immediately the cock crew. While the trial was in progress, another drama was unfolding on another stage nearby. As Jesus was bound in Gethsemane, two of the disciples, Peter and John, soon rallied from their panic and followed at a safe distance, behind the mass of soldiers. Arriving at Caiaphas' palace, John rushed forward. Knowing the family of the high priest, and probably having been in the home before, he was acquainted not only with the place, but also the household servants. So he got inside with the crowd. Some, however, Peter was left outside in the street, and the door was shut. While John noticed that Peter was left outside, he went to the young maid at the door and asked her to open the gate and allow Peter to enter. It was a friendly gesture, but Peter was probably not too happy about it. Coming inside reluctantly, Peter remained just inside the gate, watching from the shadows. He felt trapped. At last, he noticed the young maid watching him closely. What should he do? He did not dare go, as John did, into the judgment hall. Perhaps he half wished to be back out on the street. Since it was a cold evening, the soldiers had built a fire in the middle of the courtyard. Peter strolled forward into the group gathered around the fire there, and sitting down among them, he began to warm himself. No doubt the soldiers were talking about the Lord, making jokes and mocking remarks about him, but Peter remained silent. He dared not defend the Lord. The young maiden who had been watching Peter finally came forward to the group gathered around that fire with a malicious look in her eye and said, This is one of the Nazarene's followers. Peter was taken completely by surprise. It was as if the mask had been torn from his face. In a moment of terror, he suddenly realized that he, having listened to all the jokes without a word in defense for Jesus, could not now speak up and claim to be his disciple. He had denied his master in act, or rather by his inact, before he denied him in his word. I do not know what you mean, he said. No one pursued the issue, but Peter was still uneasy, and soon he slipped away from the fire and stumbled back to the gate. But the maid noticed him and again spoke. That is one of the Nazarene's followers. By this time, Peter was angry. He flung an angry oath at her, turned on his heel, and went back to the fire. Now, panic-stricken, he lost control. He was boiling with conflicting emotions and could not keep quiet. He joined the conversations at the fireside, talking loudly and defiantly. Relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off recognized him, however, and once more Peter was accused. This time he became blind with rage and denied Christ with oaths and curses. While Peter was in the midst of the outbreak of denial and profanity, the eyes of the tormentors turned away from him to another object. Jesus, condemned by his enemies, were being led out of the hall to the guard room across the courtyard. He hears the Galilean accent of his disciple. Turning quickly, he looked in Peter's direction. At the same moment, Peter turned as well, and their eyes met. Jesus did not speak, but who could say what was in his look? That look from Christ made Peter the great man that he would later become. Christ's look was not one of anger or bitterness, as it might have been from us if we had been rejected by someone who we thought was a friend. It was a look of a rescuer. Would Peter rush out into the night and commit suicide as Judas had done? Had it been an angry look, that might be what Peter had done, but it contained not a spark of anger. Instead, his eyes showed pain and disappointment. But deeper still is a look of love and compassion. Peter saw now the kind of Lord whom he had denied. As a result, he sobbed bitterly, turning toward the gate, and this time finding his way out into the night. Would to God that we could look into those same eyes and see both our own life and that of our Savior's. Look at those suffering in those loving eyes. Can you deny that kind of Lord? May this lesson challenge our hearts and increase our love to such bounds that we will be dedicated Christians that Peter later became.